Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
January 13th, 1920. The New York Times publishes an editorial about a physics professor from Massachusetts who claims rockets could work in the vacuum of space. The Times is not impressed. The professor, they write, seems to lack the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools about basic physics. He doesn't understand that rockets need air to push against. The editorial drips with condescension. The professor is a fool chasing an impossible dream. The professor's name is Robert Goddard, and the Times is completely, catastrophically wrong. July 17th, 1969. Apollo 11 is racing toward the moon. The New York Times publishes a correction to that 1920 editorial. It reads, "Further investigation and experimentation have confirmed the findings of Isaac Newton in the 17th century, and it is now definitely established that a rocket can function in a vacuum as well as in an atmosphere." The Times regrets the error. It took them 49 years to admit they were wrong. Robert Goddard had been dead for 24 of those years, having never seen a rocket reach space. But every rocket that ever flew, from the German V-2 to the Saturn V carrying Apollo 11, was built on the principles he had proven on a cold day in March 1926. This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. On March 16, 1926, in a snow-covered cabbage field in Auburn, Massachusetts, Robert Goddard launched a contraption that looked like plumbing pipes attached to a metal frame. It flew for 2.5 seconds, reached 41 feet, and crashed 184 feet away. His wife Esther filmed it. No newspapers covered it. The event seemed insignificant. But that rickety rocket was the ancestor of every spacecraft that would ever fly. Goddard had proven that liquid fuel rockets could work, the technology that would eventually take humans to the moon. And here's what fascinates me about Robert Goddard. He was absolutely right about the future. He understood rocket physics better than almost anyone alive. His patents covered nearly every major rocket innovation that would matter for the next 50 years. And yet, he died in 1945 believing he had failed, having never seen a rocket reach space. Meanwhile, the Germans, who had studied his work and built on his ideas, developed the V-2 rocket that could reach 100 miles up. Understanding Goddard's story requires holding multiple truths. He was a visionary genius whose work made space travel possible. His secretive, isolated approach was inefficient compared to the collaborative, well-funded German program. America failed him by mocking and underfunding transformative research. And his specific methods turned out to be, as one NASA historian put it, close to a dead end, even though his foundational ideas were essential. All of these things are true. Picture this. It's a cold day in March, 1926. 4 people stand in a snowy field in Auburn, Massachusetts. There's Robert Goddard, a physics professor at Clark University, his wife Esther with her movie camera, 2 colleagues from Clark, Percy Roop and Henry Sachs. They're gathered around a 10-foot contraption that looks absurd, a combustion chamber on top, connected by thin tubes to fuel tanks at the bottom. It resembles a bizarre ladder more than anything that could fly. Goddard touches a blowtorch to an opening near the top. There's a roar. For several seconds, nothing happens. Then the rocket lifts slowly from its frame and shoots upward at what Goddard would later describe as express train speed. It curves left, still accelerating, and plows into the frozen ground. The whole flight lasts less than 3 seconds. Goddard's diary entry is remarkably understated. The first flight with a rocket using liquid propellants was made yesterday. That's it. No celebration, no press conference. The local newspapers don't even cover it. And Goddard keeps it secret for a decade. This moment of triumph is also a moment of profound isolation. Let me build the clock for you. Goddard was born in 1882 and grew up reading H.G. Wells. As a teenager, he became obsessed with the idea of space travel. By the early 1900s, he was conducting serious physics research at Worcester Polytechnic Institute and Clark University. In 1919, the Smithsonian Institution published his paper, A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. It was rigorous science, mathematical calculations about how rockets could reach the upper atmosphere and potentially even the moon. Then came that New York Times editorial in January 1920. The mockery was brutal, and it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of physics. The Times thought rockets needed air to push against, like a propeller. But Goddard understood Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. The rocket pushes exhaust backward. The exhaust pushes the rocket forward. No air required. This isn't complicated physics. It's basic mechanics. The Times was simply wrong. But the mockery did its damage. It made Goddard even more secretive, more protective of his work. He'd already been cautious. Now he became nearly paranoid about sharing his research. He feared others would steal credit. He worried that if he published his findings, German scientists might use them for military purposes. So he worked in isolation. By the early 1920s, Goddard had figured out that liquid fuels, gasoline and liquid oxygen, would be far more efficient than solid gunpowder. This was the breakthrough. Liquid fuels could be controlled, throttled, shut off, and restarted. They offered much higher performance. In December 1925, he successfully tested a liquid fuel engine in his laboratory. It worked. It lifted its own weight. Now he just needed to make it fly. That's what brought him to his Aunt Effie's farm on March 16, 1926. The successful flight proved the concept. Liquid fuel rockets were possible. It was the Wright brothers' moment for rocketry, crude, brief, but revolutionary. Goddard had opened the door to space travel, but almost nobody noticed. Here's what troubles me about what happened next. Goddard continued his work throughout the late 1920s and 1930s. He got some funding from the Smithsonian and later from the Guggenheim Foundation after aviator Charles Lindbergh recognized the importance of his work. He moved to Roswell, New Mexico, where he could test larger rockets without attracting attention. Between 1930 and 1941, he launched 35 rockets. Some reached altitudes of 9,000 feet. He developed gyroscopic stabilization, steering vanes, fuel pumps, parachute recovery systems, every major rocket technology. But Goddard worked almost entirely alone. He was intensely secretive. He published very little. His funders begged him to collaborate with other scientists, to share his research, to build a team. He refused. He wanted complete control. And in fairness to Goddard, his caution wasn't entirely paranoid. His fears about German military use proved prescient. Meanwhile, in Germany, rocket enthusiasts had read Goddard's 1919 paper. They understood what he was trying to do, and they had something Goddard didn't have: resources, and government support. In the 1930s, the German military invested heavily in rocket development. They built teams of engineers. They shared information. They tested systematically. By 1942, the German V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, reached an altitude of 176 kilometers, well into space. It used liquid fuel, gyroscopic guidance, steering vanes, and pumps. Nearly everything came from Goddard's foundational ideas, but executed with massive resources and collaborative engineering. Goddard died in August 1945, just days before Japan surrendered. He died of throat cancer, still working on projects for the Navy. He never saw a rocket reach space. The highest any of his rockets flew was less than 2 miles. In his own terms, by his own goals, he had failed. But here's the complexity. After the war, when American scientists examined captured V-2 rockets and interrogated German engineers, they found that Goddard's patents had anticipated almost everything. Wernher von Braun, the German rocket scientist who later led America's space program, acknowledged that Goddard's work had been foundational. NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center is named in his honor. Every liquid fuel rocket ever built, from the V-2 to the Saturn V to the Space Shuttle to SpaceX's Falcon 9, is descended from that 2.5-second flight in a Massachusetts cabbage field. So was Goddard a success or a failure? Both. His ideas were revolutionary and correct. His execution was hampered by lack of resources and his own secretiveness. The Germans proved his concepts worked when given proper funding and teamwork. But Goddard's isolation meant his specific approach was, in the words of one Air and Space Museum curator, close to a dead end. The American rocket program that emerged after World War II learned more from German engineers than from Goddard's own rockets. I find myself thinking about what America lost by not supporting Goddard properly. Imagine if, instead of mockery from the New York Times, he'd received recognition. Imagine if, instead of scraping by on small grants, he'd had the resources the Germans gave their rocket program. Imagine if American institutions had believed in the possibility of space travel enough to fund it seriously in the 1920s and 1930s. We can't know for certain, but it's possible America could have led in rocket technology from the beginning. Instead, we spent the 1950s and 1960s racing to catch up to what German scientists had built using American ideas. We won that race. We did get to the moon first, but we had to import the German team to do it. We're still living with the consequences of how societies treat revolutionary ideas. Think about mRNA vaccine research. Scientists worked on mRNA technology for decades, often with minimal funding, frequently dismissed as pursuing an impractical approach. The research was slow. Many institutions were skeptical. Then COVID-19 hit, and suddenly those mRNA vaccines saved millions of lives. The science had been there all along, waiting. We just hadn't invested in it properly. Or consider climate science, artificial intelligence research, quantum computing, fields where today's impractical ideas might be tomorrow's essential technologies. How many Robert Goddards are working right now on problems that seem unsolvable? And how many of them are we failing to support because their ideas seem too far-fetched? The economist William Nordhaus once calculated that innovators typically capture only about 2% of the social value they create. The other 98% goes to society. Goddard captured even less than that. He died believing he'd failed while the world was about to enter the space age he'd made possible. The tragedy isn't just personal. It's that we almost lost the space age entirely because we couldn't recognize transformative research when we saw it. But I also have to acknowledge Goddard's role in his own isolation. His secrecy, while understandable given that brutal Times editorial and his fears about military misuse, held back progress. His refusal to collaborate meant his work had less impact than it could have. The Germans succeeded partly because they worked as teams, shared information, and built on each other's work. Science advances fastest when it's collaborative and open. This is the tension at the heart of Goddard's story. He was right about the science and wrong about the method. America was wrong to mock him, and right that collaborative, well-funded research produces faster results. His work was foundational and also a dead end. He failed by his own standards and succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn wrote about how paradigm shifts happen, how revolutionary ideas overturn conventional wisdom. But he also noted that the revolutionary often pays a personal cost. They're dismissed as cranks until suddenly everyone realizes they were right all along. Goddard fits that pattern perfectly. That New York Times correction in 1969, published the day after Apollo 11 launched toward the moon, came 49 years too late for Goddard to see it. But it stands as a monument to how spectacularly wrong institutions can be when confronted with ideas that challenge conventional thinking. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, think about this. How do we recognize revolutionary ideas before they're proven? What's the cost of waiting until we're certain? And how many transformative breakthroughs are we missing right now because they seem too impractical, too expensive, or too far-fetched? Because that's what Robert Goddard's story teaches us. Not just about rockets and space travel, but about how societies decide which ideas deserve support. Goddard was brilliant and isolated. America failed him, and he failed himself. His work was essential and inefficient. All of these things are true. And somewhere right now, there's probably another person with an idea that seems impossible but might save the world, if we're willing to believe in it before the proof arrives. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, then please tell a friend. I hope you will join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.